The Intellectual Gentlemen's Club.
Welcome back to the IGC podcast. I'm Jason Abbott. I want to thank you guys again for sharing and getting the word out, social media, rating us on iTunes and Stitcher, things of that matter. Appreciate everybody's support out there. If you do want to support us, we have a page right on our website, intellectualgentlemensclub.com. It's the support tab. It has our affiliate sponsors on there. We have Amazon.com, Onnit.com, and Audible.com are our affiliate sponsors. If you want to support us, go ahead and check that out. We also have a PayPal button in there for donations. I always suggest if you guys have any donations to give them to my previous guests or today's guest. But if you have anything extra, just shoot it our way, and we appreciate everything we get out there. So back with us today on the IGC is Jeff Schloff making his triumphant return. How you doing, Jeff?
I'm doing good. When did I do the first one? When was that?
It was many months ago. It was episode 4.
I think I had a different job.
Yeah, you did have a different job at that point, yeah. So now, what are you doing now over there?
I'm still an environmental guy, but I'm working in environmental compliance for a consultant out of Ann Arbor. A lot of chemical regulatory compliance and environmental engineering and construction. So it's pretty interesting stuff, just getting into it.
Good stuff, man.
Yeah.
Good to hear it. Our guest today is Kevin Kamps. Excuse me. He is a individual who works for the Radioactive Waste Watchdog at Beyond Nuclear. They are a nonprofit organization based in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Previously, he worked in D.C. for the Nuclear Information and Resource Service. He has served on the statewide board of directors of Don't Waste Michigan for over the last 15 years. Some of his activism work is he was founder and director of the World Tree Peace Center in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and he participated in a walk across Europe for a nuclear-free world. He's also the recipient of the 2010 Josephine Butler Nuclear-Free Future Award from the Hiroshima-Nagasaki Peace Committee of Washington, D.C. Welcome to the show, Kevin. Thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Yeah. So those of us who are listening out there who don't know what Beyond Nuclear is, can you break us down what exactly you guys do over there?
Sure. We are a watchdog group on the nuclear power industry, and we're mostly focused on North America. Canada has 20 reactors itself, and then the United States has 100 right now that are still operating. But, when Fukushima blew up, then we got a lot of calls from overseas as well. So we are engaged in the issues in Europe and Asia and other parts of the world. So my focus at Beyond Nuclear is mostly on the radioactive waste issue, although since I'm from Michigan, I get deployed out here a lot for problem reactors like Palisades in West Michigan, Davis-Besse in Northwest Ohio, and others.
Interesting. So you sent me some interesting information when we hooked up through email. You sent me a documentation about some of the issues behind Southeast Michigan and the radioactive crosshairs, some atomic reactors and nuclear waste risks. What would you say are some of the greatest dangers right now in the Great Lakes area?
Yeah, I did that backgrounder called Southeast Michigan and the radioactive crosshairs just because it was so, mind-boggling how much is going on. So, it's a really long list. You've got the currently biggest operating nuclear power plant in the world because the Japanese competition is shut down. That's Bruce Nuclear Generating Station in Ontario. It's just, 50 miles or so across from the tip of the thumb in Michigan on the Ontario shoreline. And that one facility alone has so much going on. It's got a total of 9 reactors, all told. It's got an immense amount of radioactive waste stored there. In fact, they've been importing so-called low-level radioactive waste from all 20 reactors in Ontario to the Bruce site. And they've been incinerating some of it, incredibly enough. And now what they've proposed is to bury the waste just a mile or less from the shore of Lake Huron. All of those fights going on simultaneously. They even tried to ship some of the radioactive waste on the Great Lakes, and we stopped that a couple years ago. So that's what's going on the Canada side. You've got at Fermi 2 in Monroe County, the biggest
That's
General
just south
Electric.
of Detroit for you listeners out there who don't know where that is. That's the closest reactor to Detroit. Am I right about that?
Yeah, it's going to be about 25 miles south of Detroit. The Fermi nuclear power plant has a pretty infamous history. You've got the 1966 meltdown that was chronicled in the book We Almost Lost Detroit by John Fuller. That took place in 1966, and the book came out 9 years later. So before the book, hardly anybody knew about it. But they had a partial meltdown in the core of Fermi 1. That was a very near miss to a catastrophic accident. And now you've got Fermi 2 that's been operating since 1988. It's the largest General Electric Mark I boiling water reactor in the world. And that's the exact identical design as Fukushima Daiichi Units 1 to 4. Only Fermi 2 is so big, it's as big as Fukushima Daiichi Units 1 and 2 put together. And another big issue at Fukushima is the waste that's stuck in the storage pool, the high-level radioactive waste. Fermi 2 has multiple times as much waste as any of the pools at Fukushima Daiichi. So there's a couple there. Davis Bessie is to the east of Toledo on the Lake Erie shoreline, and what's pretty incredible is you can see Fermi from Davis Bessie across the lake with the naked eye. It's only about 30 miles as the crow flies. So Davis Bessie probably has the worst operating reactor record in the United States.
It makes me feel comfortable. Yeah, I feel good about that one.
Quite a string of near misses. It had a 3 Mile Island precursor incident in 1977, about 18 months before 3 Mile Island had the meltdown. And if only the experience at Davis Bessie had been communicated to the twin designs, in the United States, 3 Mile Island probably could have been averted, but they covered it up. You had a 1985 steam generator dry out at Davis Bessie with workers literally sprinting down hallways, having to chop through chains to try to turn valves manually to try to prevent a meltdown. They came, very close to a meltdown at that point. You had a tornado strike at Davis Bessie in June of 98 that, again, was a near disaster. And then the most infamous thing that's happened at Davis Bessie is a corrosion hole in the reactor lid. It's called the hole in the head fiasco, where they only had 3/16 of an inch of metal left on the lid. And it was soon to burst. And if that had happened, you would have had the liquid coolant in the reactor core instantly flash into steam, and you would have had a meltdown very quickly.
So who was the one guy that was sitting on the top? There had to be one guy left that was holding that down, right?
Well, Homer Simpson is his name. There's an episode where Homer is eating a few too many donuts, but it really comes in, handy because he's the one that has to sit on the hole. So
doesn't he end up plugging the hole with his whole body?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep.
It'd be good to be a cartoon in that kind of situation.
Thank God for the Simpsons, I tell you.
Well, it's amazing that we're still at a point of awareness, because if you say, not in your world, Kevin, but around here, if you say 3 Mile Island or Fermi, people have an idea what you're talking about. For the most part, we don't have that much knowledge of what's going on around us, especially considering what he just told us and how many reactors are around us and facilities, especially the one right across Lake Huron.
Yeah, I think
I had no idea it was there, and I consider myself, I'm not living under a mushroom.
Right. I had heard about a partial meltdown with Fermi 1 from somebody I used to work with years ago, and I at the time I thought it was a bunch of bullshit, but I Googled it, and it turns out it's a terrifying prospect of what could happen or what could have happened. Mentioning it's so close to Detroit, it's really crazy that these technologies can really get away from us like that. Can we talk about the nuclear technologies a little bit? A lot of people out there who are listening might be a little bit over my head. It's over my head as well. I'm a little too stupid to know about the difference between fusion and fission technologies. So could you run over what exactly the technologies are that are used in the world right now?
Yeah, I've been getting the same answer from my dad for 20 years. They should talk to France.
Well, everything I've been talking about so far has been atomic fission. So it's the splitting of uranium-235 atoms to generate heat, to boil water, to make steam, to run a turbine and make electricity. So the most complicated, risky, and expensive way humans have ever come up with to boil water,
right?
For one thing. You've got different reactor designs. Two big breakdowns are pressurized water reactors. We have 69 of those in the United States. And then you've got boiling water reactors, and we have 34 of those in the United States. So Fukushima Daiichi is a General Electric boiling water reactor, and it's the oldest vintage, Mark I, going back to, they designed the thing in the 60s. They built them starting in 1970, and that's what you got at Fermi 2. And then pressurized water reactors, the GE boiling water reactors, that's most of the boiling water reactors. The pressurized water reactors are mostly a Westinghouse phenomenon. So that would include Davis Besse, although that's a company called Combustion Engineering that designed that. A plant that I didn't even talk about yet is Palisades in West Michigan, which is how I got involved in all this stuff 20 plus years ago. That's another pressurized water reactor. So those are the two big breakdowns. Each one has its own problems, its own pathways to disaster that we could go into more. The Fermi 1 was actually an experimental reactor. It was called a plutonium breeder reactor, where they would actually turn uranium-238, which is not fissile. You can't run a reactor on uranium-238. But what you can do is you can make plutonium out of it through a transmutation at the atomic level, neutron absorption, and a changeover into plutonium. And what they wanted to do was to extract the plutonium. The original plan, which is really fascinating, and it did not even come out in John Fuller's excellent book, We Almost Lost Detroit, because I don't think it was known yet. It was top secret. Back in the early 1950s, Detroit Edison and the other companies involved wanted to use the plutonium from Fermi 1 for nuclear weapons. They were going to sell the plutonium back to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission for nuclear weapons. Eisenhower gave his big speech, Atoms for Peace, at the United Nations in 1953. And ruined their plans, and all of a sudden it was now about electricity, not about weapons, So that's an incredible, skeleton in the closet at Fermi 1. That was a breeder reactor, and it would breed more plutonium than it consumed, this perpetual motion machine idea, but the dangers were made evident with the meltdown. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, actually served on the advisory committee on reactor safeguards and advised against building Fermi 1. That committee saw it as too dangerous, and the Atomic Energy Commission just blew them off and built it anyway.
Whatever, we want to do it, right?
What's that?
It's just, hey, whatever, we want to do it. Technology's there, so let's just
do it. The United Auto Workers filed a major lawsuit in the early 60s, and it's known as UAW versus Atomic Energy Commission. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the UAW said, hey, look, we've got 500,000 union members within 50 miles of this proposal. You can't do this. And by a 7-2 vote at the Supreme Court, they said the Atomic Energy Commission is in charge of this thing. Whatever they say goes. But the dissenting opinion was really powerful, and there's excerpts in Fuller's book where one of the justices pretty much said this is a dark day for democracy, where an unaccountable federal bureaucracy can make decisions like this.
There seems to be there's a lot of that going around nowadays.
Yeah, that was a huge precedent that was set, over 50 years ago now, and really now that descendant of the Atomic Energy Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, runs roughshod all the time on, the public and even state governments. But there's a lot of successes. I mean, I mentioned us stopping the radioactive waste boats on the Great Lakes that were, originating in Canada. But just recently, it was in August, the state of Vermont, tiny Vermont, 700,000 people, beat one of the biggest nuclear utilities in the country, Entergy, which happens to own Palisades in West Michigan, and beat the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and forced Entergy to shut down. It's not going to shut down until later this year, but Entergy said we're going to shut down Vermont Yankee, and that was the grassroots anti-nuclear movement of Vermont, which convinced the state government to do the right thing. And it took literally, all told, it took 40 years to win this victory, but they just accomplished it.
Don't they have money out there too?
In Vermont?
Yeah.
Not the folks I work with, I tell you. It was a genuine grassroots victory. I mean, there's, it's a progressive state on a lot of different issues. But this one of my coworkers at Beyond Nuclear was based in New England in the 70s and has told me a bunch of stories about, fighting Vermont Yankee in the early 70s. So this is a major grassroots victory that took a long time.
So with the technology you're talking about, you mentioned that you need uranium-235 to operate a reactor. Is that right?
That is the fissile component. That's the atom that splits and can sustain a chain reaction. So you're getting, neutrons coming off of the split that then keep that chain reaction going.
So you mentioned something about plutonium in a perpetual cycle. Isn't that more of like a fusion-based technology? And that's something that really hasn't been developed yet, right?
Well, that was also fission, where plutonium-239 is the fissile ingredient. So instead of uranium-235, and the breeder would be a design that would generate by converting uranium-238, which is relatively plentiful in nature, converting that to a fissile material, plutonium-239. And yeah, fusion, the joke about fusion is that it's always 25 years away. Like in the 1950s, it was 25 years away, and it still is at this point. So that's a whole nother can of worms talking about fusion.
Gotcha.
So you mentioned the Palisades facility. Is that in the Kalamazoo area, or?
Yeah, it's on the Lake Michigan shoreline in a ironically named town called Covert. It's about 5 miles south of South Haven. So Kalamazoo's 35 miles to the east and directly downwind.
Yeah, which we are also. And you said that was problematic?
There's a lot of shit downwind.
Yeah, it's one of the most troubled reactors in the entire country. 2011 was an especially bad year, and it got Palisades landed on NRC's bad list. And then Fred Upton, the congressman from Southwest Michigan, who's the chair of Energy and Commerce in the U.S. House, pressured NRC to take them off the list, and they did right away, pretty much. They're having accidents, incidents, breakdowns all the time at Palisades. Last May, they had a 80-gallon leak of radioactive water directly into Lake Michigan. They've had a leak into the control room from a giant tank of water, very unfortunately located directly above the control room, that was going on for years and would still be a secret if it weren't for some very courageous whistleblowers at Palisades who worked with a lawyer in Washington, D.C., who brought it to the attention of another member of Congress named Ed Markey, who's now a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, who made it known in an open letter to the NRC. Otherwise, they would still have this leak in the control room. They were catching the leak and may still be in buckets. So there was actually a bucket near the central control panel in the control room that was catching this leak. If that leak were to change direction and all of a sudden fall onto control room panels, which has happened, they could short circuit the panels and you'd be in a heap of trouble right away. And they had a similar incident. It wasn't because of the leak. It was because of changing of a light bulb, actually. They had a massive loss of power to the control room at Palisades back in September of 2011. That was a very serious incident and another close call at Palisades.
I think people envision some brilliant scientists that, everyone that works at one of these facilities is just
right.
a super brain, but it's just your average jackass.
I think that's where The Simpsons really gets it right. I mean, that loss of power, the electrician was nearly electrocuted. But what's more significant to the entire region, I suppose, is that they accidentally, through losing electricity, they turned safety systems off that were supposed to be on, and they turned safety systems on that were supposed to be off. And one of those was the emergency core cooling system.
Convenient.
And perhaps the what?
Real convenient.
It almost was the final blow, because there's this problem at Palisades called reactor pressure vessel embrittlement, and it means that the 8-inch thick metal walls holding the nuclear chain reaction are very brittle after 42 years of neutron bombardment. And what can happen is, if that hot reactor vessel all of a sudden is flooded with cold water, it could crack like a hot glass into cold water. Only there's immense pressure on those walls. It's 2,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. And Palisades is the worst embrittled reactor in the United States. And this is a vulnerability specific to the pressurized water reactor design. So they're really taking a risk continuing to operate this reactor. And then when they have an incident like the, accidental activation of the emergency core cooling system, that's all it could take. And fortunately, the thing did not actually work. It was ordered to work accidentally, inadvertently, and it did not work. It's good that it did not work that time because it could have been what caused the fracture. But it's also troubling that it did not work because that's the final line of defense to cool a reactor that's on the brink of a meltdown.
I mean, it seems like we're children messing with some kind of alien technology that we don't have any freaking control of because, I mean, how long has excuse me, dealing with a cold today. How many years has nuclear power been around? Like 70 years, 80 years approximately?
Well, the Manhattan Project was the beginning. So,
it's like 45?
Enrico Fermi, back in 1942, created the first prototype reactor. And that was all about the bomb. And the first commercial reactor to be built in the United States was 1957. So we're, over 70 years into reactors, although they were military. And, on the radioactive waste issue, we still haven't dealt with Fermi's waste from 1942. It's still in temporary storage, so to speak. So that's a whole other issue, is the radioactive waste we're making, which really, is a curse on all future generations.
So we have nuclear power. You have the uranium-235 that's used to create a fission reaction. Once that fuel is spent, it goes to a cooling container of some sort. From what I've heard about Fukushima and all the news that's been coming out of there for the last couple of years, but where does this spent fuel rods that are still highly radioactive, where do they end up? Is it just kind of up in the air and they just keep moving the stuff around until they find a permanent location? Because like you hear about Yucca Mountain, and that's supposed to be like a permanent fix, where you're going to confine all this hazardous waste under one house in the middle of the desert where it's not affecting many people, allegedly. So how does it get there, and when is it okay to transfer some type of material like that across state borders, across the interstate, and not create Spider-Man in the process, driving by all these people on the highway?
Well, the first thing that happens is when the uranium-235 is exhausted and you can't efficiently make electricity anymore with that nuclear fuel, they're going to take it out of the reactor, and the first place it goes is an indoor pool of water. They call it a pond, they call it a basin. It's a storage pool. At the boiling water reactors like Fermi Unit 2 in Monroe County, those are elevated. They're some 50 feet up in the air. It was for convenience just to take it out of the reactor, which is also elevated up in the air, and just move it over to the pool. But what it's meant at Fukushima Daiichi Unit number 4, for example, is you've got a building that's on the brink of collapse, and they can't get the waste out of the pool. It's 50 feet up in the air. They got to get it down to the ground to a safer location. They've spent the last 2.5 years rebuilding the infrastructure on Unit 4 at Fukushima Daiichi to be able to support a crane that can lift these 100-ton loads, these waste transfer casks, down to the ground. Ironically enough, Fermi Unit 2 has the same problem, so to speak. They can't get the waste out of the pool at Fermi Unit 2 because they forgot or neglected or tried to save money on installing the structural welds in the building at Fermi 2 to safely hold a crane that can lift 100-ton loads down to the ground. So they've had a permit from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to remove fuel from the pool at Fermi 2 for several years now, and they haven't removed a single fuel assembly because of this problem. So presumably they're putting those structural welds in place as we speak.
So
after 5 years in the pool, then the waste is supposedly now cool enough to move into dry cask storage.
After
and
5
this is
years?
That's a
5
long
years.
cool down process. I mean, it sounds insane to me. It sounds like you're trying to hold a demon down in a cage or something.
Well, the pools are very vulnerable to things like a drain down accident. At Palisades again, October 2005, they nearly dropped one of these. It was actually 107 tons waste transfer cask. They had a crane get stuck, And they had dismissed so many of their experienced workers to try to save money that the workers dealing with the situation didn't even understand the crane, and they were trying to override the emergency brake, which was doing its job. And they nearly succeeded, which would have released the thing, and it would have plunged into the pool and probably punched a hole in the floor, and away goes the cooling water. You've got hundreds of tons of high-level radioactive waste in these pools, and it would only take an hour or two at that point to heat to the point where the metal cladding, the zirconium metal cladding on the fuel rods self-ignites. At that point, it would be Chernobyl on steroids. There's no radiological containment structure around the pools, and that's what they're facing at Fukushima Daiichi Unit Number 4, is if that building collapses and the pool water drains away, then the waste could catch on fire and dwarf what's happened so far by an order of magnitude.
So, Kevin, what's the purpose of this elevation in the first place? It seems like that's creating all the problems. Are they just creating a safe distance for high density radiation?
No, it was simply a matter of convenience. And the elevation with the pools is at the boiling water reactors. So it's to make it easier just to move it from the reactor to the pool. At the pressurized water reactors, most of the pools are at ground level, so like at Palisades, but you still have the dangers of drain downs even then.
There's always a plug somewhere, right?
Well, they actually had a pool over in Illinois, southwest of Chicago, that nearly drained down because of a frozen pipe in the wintertime. So there are, all sorts of accident scenarios.
So when you talk about the drain down, back to Fukushima, which we haven't really gotten to, but there have been reading reports about underground explosions, and what have you heard, or what's your take on that?
Well, there have been some things put out even recently that are dubious. Without documentation, without backup. What we do know at Fukushima Daiichi is that 3 reactors melted down. What we do not know, and Tokyo Electric is infamous for concealing things for sometimes years on end, is we do not know where those melted cores are at exactly. And we do know that they melted through the reactor pressure vessels and fell down to the floor. Whether they melted through the radiological containment structures is another question. Tokyo Electric and the Japanese government would say, yes, the containments are damaged. Perhaps at Unit 2 it's even destroyed. But they say that the mother load of radioactivity is still inside the containment. And I think that's very questionable. So those melted cores could very well have melted through their containment structures and could be sitting, so to speak, in the groundwater. And certainly there is a continuous flow of radioactivity into the ocean to the tune of something like 70,000 gallons per day that they just can't hold back. They actually tried to build a wall, so to speak.
Ice wall, they call it?
They haven't gotten to that yet. This was a chemical compound that they injected into the soil to harden the soil. And all it did was build up the groundwater flow behind it like a dam, underground dam. And eventually the water simply passed over the top of that underground wall and flowed directly into the ocean. So there's 70,000 gallons per day of this flow into the ocean, and it's picking up radioactivity somehow, either from these damaged or destroyed containments or the melted cores being, literally in the groundwater. And even though there's this 70,000 gallons flowing into the ocean, there's an even bigger amount of water that Tokyo Electric is capturing each and every day and pumping into a storage tank farm that is growing every day. They're building new tanks. These are giant 30-foot tall tanks that hold 1,000 tons of water, something like 200,000 gallons of water. And they've had all kinds of problems with the storage tanks. They've had tanks that just simply leaked out their contents. They've had a lot of overflows. They've been hit by typhoons in recent months. And, there's the risk that they've really been holding the water because they haven't been able to filter it yet. And it's got some very dangerous poisons in it, like strontium-90, which is a bone seeker, cesium-137, which is a muscle seeker.
Now, where do those come from? Because I hear those terms a lot. Well, that is a byproduct of the radiation, or what exactly is those? What are those?
Well, when the uranium-235 atom is split, the fission products, as they're called. These are the fragments of the uranium-235 atom, include things like cesium-137, strontium-90.
These are still radioactive elements, correct?
Yeah,
Well,
they're
not
fragments
elements,
of uranium-235. They don't exist in nature because fission reactions don't take place in nature. Only humans do that. So you're creating a whole a stew, an alphabet soup of artificial elements. Fission products are among those. Then you've got another form of radioactive byproducts from nuclear power, and those are the transuranics. Again, artificial elements beyond uranium on the periodic table that did not exist before humans started fissioning atoms.
Tinkering.
So you've got plutonium, and you've got neptunium, you've got other transuranic elements.
Einstein.
And then another category would be what are called activation products, where the metal of the reactor pressure vessel, for example, absorb neutrons, and you get some pretty serious radioactive substances like cobalt-60 that have picked up extra neutrons that way. So you're creating all these artificial elements that nature and human bodies really don't know how to deal with, that can cause tremendous damage at the cellular level, at the DNA level. One of the risks of that storage tank farm is that maybe if they're successful, they will get the strontium and the cesium out. They have no plans to get the tritium out. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen. It exists in nature because of cosmic radiation, but at very low levels. But these storage tanks contain immense amounts of tritium from this disaster at Fukushima Daiichi, and they have no plans to filter it out because there is no way to filter it out. It's radioactive hydrogen. It's too small to filter at industrial scale. I mean, maybe you could do it at a lab at immense cost, but they have no plans, and so chances are, when people aren't looking, when the fishing industry of Japan, which has been the main impediment to this release to the ocean, when they're looking the other way, then they're going to let that stuff go into the ocean.
It's crazy. Some of the other major disasters that people have heard over the years. I mean, you dropped a lot of knowledge on us about all the smaller incidents that have taken place across the Great Lakes, especially. I just largely feel like it's out of the media just to keep it, away from prying eyes, perhaps. But some of the larger disasters, we're talking like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl. What is the primary difference between what's happening at Fukushima right now and what happened back then? Because 3 Mile Island, is it still radioactive out there? Because I know Chernobyl is, and you really can't get in there really ever. I mean, what's the half-life of a place like that? When can people get back into these type of areas where they experience a meltdown?
Well, Chernobyl and Fukushima are quite comparable global catastrophes. We actually, it was pretty ironic timing when Fukushima blew up. It was March of 2011, and April of 2011 was the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl. So our organization and others had already geared up to commemorate the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl. And so we had this gentleman named Alexei Yablokov come to Washington, D.C. He's the author of a book, or the editor of a book called Chernobyl, The Consequences for Human Health and the Environment. And he spoke at the National Press Club as Fukushima is in the headlines on a daily basis. And he pointed out that Fukushima could well prove worse than Chernobyl because Japan is so densely populated. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but the emissions into the ocean are also unprecedented. So Chernobyl still has a dead zone that actually has grown because the radioactivity in the soil and in plant matter, for example, that catches fire in forest fires, and they've had, a series of forest fires in the Chernobyl region, the radioactivity blows around and moves, and especially in water, so in groundwater flow, in the annual melting of the snow in the Chernobyl area. And they've had to move the dead zone further and further out, especially in the northwest direction. So it began at an arbitrary 20-mile radius at Chernobyl, but it continues to grow in the northwest direction. And then you've got Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, downstream, down the Dnieper River. So the impacts of Chernobyl still unfold. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years. Strontium-90 also about a 30-year half-life. you have to multiply the half-life by 10 or 20 to get the hazardous persistence. So we're talking 300 to 600 years of hazard from cesium-137.
Many lifetimes.
You never see chicken Kiev on menus anymore. Either.
Hell no.
Well, then you've got plutonium-239 with a half-life of 24,000 years. So the hazardous persistence is 240,000 to 480,000 years. And that's the stuff, Chernobyl was a large-scale explosion that blew the radioactive contaminants sky high. 50% of the fallout fell in Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. The other 50% fell outside of that region. So we're talking Europe, we're talking the United States, we're talking the whole northern hemisphere.
What caused that Chernobyl meltdown or the explosion? Was it a meltdown effect, or what led up to that?
It was first a massive explosion. It was a fatal design flaw that the operators didn't know about. And the operators were taking huge safety risks. They were, ironically enough, running a safety experiment. They were trying to see how long they could run the safety systems with the reactor shut down.
You can't even make this stuff up, right? I mean, it's crazy.
It had a lot to do with the inherent secrecy of, the Soviet Union, where the designers didn't talk to the operators and vice versa. So it's just this horrible coming together of bad ideas. And they had actually deactivated the safety systems because there were built-in safety systems to prevent risky behavior by control room operators, but they dismantled them so they could run this experiment. And, they didn't have any idea what they were about to do. And it only took milliseconds for the reaction to exponentially grow. And it blew, for one thing, it blew a 1,000-ton shield lid, it's called, up in the air, and then it crashed back down. And that's some of the ongoing risk at Chernobyl is the sarcophagus that was built to try to contain all this poison underneath that didn't escape, already. There's this 1,000-ton object in there, precariously balanced on the rubble, that could fall, and bring the sarcophagus down. The sarcophagus at Chernobyl was hastily built.
What is, for people who don't understand what a sarcophagus is, could you explain that a little bit?
It's a giant concrete structure that was meant
like a coffin.
And it took the work of hundreds of thousands of workers who were being exposed to high levels of radioactivity for months on end. But because it was so quickly built, it's really on the brink of collapse. And there are plans to build another one. The first one has lasted about 25 years or a little bit more, but it's ready to fall. That would be a second Chernobyl disaster because this huge dust cloud of radioactivity would blow downwind. So they've had this new sarcophagus in the works, which will actually be the largest movable structure in human history. It's an aircraft hangar-shaped, half dome thing that's built on rail, so they can move it a half mile or so because they didn't want to build it right there because the workers would get dosed again.
Mm-hmm.
But they're taking their sweet time to build this thing, and there's probably a lot of corruption.
A lot of dollars floating around.
I'm sorry?
I said there's probably a lot of dollars floating around.
Yeah, it's at least $1 billion project, and it's only going to last 100 years. So in 100 years from now, they'll get to do it all over again.
What's the difference between Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island now?
Well, 3 Mile Island was a 50% meltdown. So, at Chernobyl, it burned for 10 days. That was why so much got out after the explosion. 3 Mile Island, 50% meltdown. The official version is not that much radioactivity got out, but I think that's very debatable. For one thing, they intentionally released a lot of radioactivity in the months and years after the accident. So they actually had liquid releases into the Susquehanna River. They had gaseous purges of containment. What's incredible about 3 Mile Island is they said, there was no meltdown. Yeah, there was some fuel damage. Maybe some fuel rods cracked. That's where the radioactivity came from. Well, they couldn't open up the reactor until, I think it was 6 years later, 1985. The meltdown was in 79. And when they opened up the reactor, lo and behold, they had a 50% meltdown. But did they go back and recalculate the amount of radioactivity that likely got out? No, they didn't really bother with any of that.
Kind of bad for business, yeah.
And the same situation at Fukushima Daiichi, for about 2 months, they denied that there had been meltdowns at Fukushima Daiichi.
Oh, was it that long?
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
'Cause I remember the day that the tsunami happened, and they started talking about the nuclear power reactors. I'm like, this is not fucking good, man. This can be the new Chernobyl and even worse.
I think that's everyone's major concern. The layman is, why the hell did they build a facility like this on a tiny island? Like
on
all the
fault
fallouts.
lines, right?
Right. And
I mean, I understand the fact that you're building it on water, because that's the only thing that's going to keep it from really exploding into, like you're talking about, this exponential reaction. Water keeps that at bay, but the water has to go back to the ocean. So, I just don't understand how we can mess with these technologies and not have these safeguards in place.
Yeah, they build reactors next to water, oceans, Great Lakes, rivers, artificial lakes, in order to cool the reactor, and they use immense amounts of water. We're talking Fukushima Daiichi has no cooling towers, so each of the reactors there depends on how big the reactors are, but could easily use 500 million gallons per day of cooling water in normal times. I know the figure
500 million gallons each?
Yeah, there's 2 reactors on the Chesapeake Bay that I'm familiar with the figures, and it's 1 billion gallons of water per day. What does that look like? It's a square mile of Chesapeake Bay down to a depth of 14 feet. That's how much water those 2 reactors use each and every day. It's a once through. They have no cooling towers at Calvert Cliffs either. At Fermi Unit 2, you're going to see that there are cooling towers there, and that reduces the amount of water by an order of magnitude. But the downside of cooling towers is instead of superheated water going back into Lake Erie, for example, what you've got steam coming off the cooling towers that is likely lost to the Great Lakes. It just blows downwind and it falls, in the Mississippi River basin instead. So,
that's drift loss, right?
Yeah, that's the amazing thing is the figure for the amount of water used by thermal electric power plants in the United States, and that would include coal, but nuclear too. It's some huge fraction of the water use in our country. And, it doesn't get talked about. They're using the water for free. They're not paying anybody for that. So that's just another huge impact of, these bad electricity sources.
We're definitely starting to see our Great Lakes water levels go down pretty consistently, and that's just another reason.
Sure.
Yeah.
Back to Chernobyl real quick. I've seen these things floating around the internet, these memes that are out there, and one particular picture is called the Medusa's Foot, where it's actually the fuel rods that have melted down into, one cohesive mass in some basement area somewhere, or burning through the earth. Is something like that even exist?
Yeah, I've heard it called the elephant foot. Yeah,
the elephant foot. I'm sorry, that's what it is.
Yeah,
Explain that.
No, I think that's legitimate. Melted fuel that then eventually cooled enough to re-solidify. So,
and you can't lay eyes on it because you'll instantly be eviscerated, basically, right? They get these by mechanical
the
cameras.
Photographers who got those images, they were being exposed to massive doses. There's actually photographs from inside the sarcophagus, and that photographer eventually died from his exposures.
There's nothing that can keep you safe at that distance, correct?
It's the gamma radiation.
Gamma rays. That's what Hulk has, people. That's the Incredible Hulk. What he's using is gamma rays.
Right.
That's the thing about the paper suits or plastic paper suits that the workers at Fukushima are wearing. It may protect you against radioactive particles that could get on your skin, or they often wear respirators as well. So you don't want to breathe this stuff in particle form or even gaseous form or liquid form, but
it's shooting through your body, right?
Protect you against gamma. That's going to zap right through the suit and you and do its damage.
Yeah. Now I'm a food guy. Everyone that knows me knows that, and I spend half of my leisure time studying how the destruction of the global food system by genetic modification, etc. And that's kind of an iffy. You worry a little bit like, oh, well, this may or may not hurt us down the line. The stuff we're talking about right now is having such a major immediate impact. It's almost like, well, you might as well just have some fun while you can, because
right.
your body's going to fall apart eventually.
What kind of mutations or what kind of radiation levels is the wildlife getting, which is eventually getting into our food supply or even the vegetables? All these in all these regions where the fallout's happening. What kind of effect is this happening currently, and what kind of effect should we be able to see 10, 20, 50 years down the road?
Yeah, because we were hearing maybe in the fall that there was fallout that was reaching, the coast of California and starting
Portland,
to affect the
right.
vegetables. There was already warnings, don't buy this and that. Do we have any definitive information as far as that goes?
Yeah, my coworker, Cindy Folkers at Beyond Nuclear, is kind of our point person on radiation and health and protecting the food supply. There's tremendous neglect and dereliction of duty by, like, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration.
Shocking.
Oh my gosh.
They're not really, measuring radioactivity in food. In fact, our standards in the United States are much weaker than Japan's. So
in most other
there's a
countries.
unit of radioactivity measure called a becquerel, which is a radioactive disintegration per second. In Japan, the limit on radioactivity in food, and this is only for cesium-137 and cesium-134, is 100 becquerels per kilogram of food. Here in the United States, it's 1,200.
I was going to say it's probably like 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
So
wow.
We could very well, and likely are, be importing radioactively contaminated food from Japan that the Japanese consider
that they won't even
human
eat.
Consumption, and just selling it to unwitting shoppers here in the United States.
That is horrifying.
Well, if you could think of a few things to avoid that would be coming from there as far as food, what would you say? Are you going to start with fish?
Well, there's huge questions because of, the massive releases that have already happened that are still going on day by day into the Pacific. There's this phenomenon called bioconcentration of radioactivity up the food chain. So cesium-137 is a mussel seeker. Bluefin tuna were
in the food chain, right?
documented in August of 2011, so just several months after this catastrophe began, swimming off the California coast. Apparently, they had spent their earlier life stage on the Fukushima coast and then swam across the ocean with radioactive cesium from the disaster in their mussel. And so that was detected just several months after. And then you've got just the flow of radioactivity that's inching its way across the ocean. And at some point, whether it's a year or two from now, well, it's dissipating, it's diluting because of the volume of the ocean, but it's also moving. So at some point, that plume will reach the west coast of North America.
Mm-hmm.
And the food supply, the seafood supply, is concentrating that up the food chain, and we're at the top of the food chain. Other things to worry about would be plants that absorb certain radioactive poisons in a big way. So ironically enough, at Chernobyl, mushrooms, the Slavic culture of that area prizes mushrooms in their diet, going back to time immemorial.
Mm-hmm.
Mushrooms are like these radioactivity concentration machines.
It's like a sponge, yeah.
So, yeah, and berries, unfortunately. So there's been education efforts, in the Chernobyl region to try to teach people what they should avoid, but it goes up against these cultural traditions. And some people just kind of I don't want to worry about it. Another issue in Chernobyl is the economic collapse. I mean, Belarus, which was hardest hit, is a Stalinist dictatorship that's suffering an economic depression. So people are needing to eat, and whether or not the food is radioactive sometimes goes way down the list because they're hungry,
Mm-hmm.
So there's that issue too.
Going back to these mushrooms, and I've heard that fungi have the ability, and maybe it's a certain kind, or maybe I'm just talking on my ass right now, but it has the ability to absorb the radiation and kind of dissipate it. Is there any kind of fungus that can do that?
Like a filter?
Yeah, it's like a filter. Maybe I'm thinking of something else, like plastics or something. I don't know.
Certainly the first part, the concentration, is absolutely true. I think the second part's not, though. I don't think that that mushrooms or other fungi can dissipate or metabolize the radioactivity. It's simply concentrated in the flesh of the mushroom. Yeah. There was a tragic story from the Chernobyl region where I believe it was the United Nations moved in there to try to help decontaminate the soil, and so they taught farmers to plant a certain plant, I can't remember what the plant was, to absorb radioactivity, but they didn't teach the farmers to then avoid the plant as radioactive waste.
Right.
So they actually fed it to their cattle, contaminated their cattle. So that's the thing is these plants that are uptaking the radioactivity become radioactive waste themselves.
So where are we at with Fukushima right now? I mean, today is January 10th, 2014. It's been going on for at least a year and a half, close to 2 years now.
Oh, it'll actually be the third anniversary.
Oh, wow.
March 11th. Yeah.
Okay, so between then and now, I mean, what are we dealing with? They continually building these casks that are storing the strontium and cesium, and we constantly have this billions, to quote Carl Sagan, billions and billions of gallons a day pumped back into the Pacific Ocean that's full of radiation. What can we expect, and is there any long-term real solution that's going to happen here, or are we just looking at another dead zone on the planet?
And have they enlisted any outside help? I know they've been secretive through everything, but are there other governments involved that are, funding things and helping in any way?
Yeah. Well, the normal cooling operations are over with. So what they have been doing on the melted cores is they have been pouring tremendous amounts of water every day on the melted cores, which contributes to that groundwater flow into the ocean. But they capture a lot of that. It goes into that storage tank farm. The other governments involved would include the United States, which has been involved from the very beginning. Some news that's just coming to light at this point is the fate of the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier. So according to certain sailors from the USS Reagan who are very sick now, and these are people in their 20s, they report, the first time I heard this was last March. It was the second anniversary of Fukushima beginning, and there was a big gathering in New York City. One of the sailors from the USS Reagan said that they were anchored a mile or two from Fukushima Daiichi, which was news to me. I had always kind of assumed that they were tens of miles out to sea.
Mm-hmm.
The Reagan was supposedly conducting, relief operations after the earthquake and tsunami, carrying food and other supplies to devastated towns by helicopter. And it was one of the first signs that there were serious radioactivity releases because the helicopters were coming back to the Reagan badly contaminated.
Wow.
But what's just coming to light this year is the Reagan may have been very, very close to Fukushima Daiichi, immediately offshore and immediately downwind.
You see
and
these
some
pictures?
of the reports by the sailors are severe symptoms of radiation poisoning. So like really bad diarrhea. It turns out that not only were the helicopters bringing radioactivity back, but if they were that close, they were getting direct fallout on deck. One of the sailors went down from the deck and set off the radiation alarms on the ship. Another recent revelation that I hadn't known about before is the Reagan's drinking water supply actually comes from desalinating seawater. So any of the radioactivity releases going into the ocean at that point were then not being filtered by the desalination system. And the sailors were drinking it, cooking with it, showering, doing their laundry. So I think there's a lot of unanswered questions about the Reagan. And the U.S. government, the Department of Energy, was even asked by Japan to fly radiation-detecting airplanes, a part of the nuclear weapons complex. They're designed to detect nuclear weapons blasts in places like North Korea, so that they can't do that secretly without the U.S. knowing about it. Part of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. But they were asked by Japan to bring those planes over to figure out where the clouds were going. So the U.S. government has known from the earliest days of this disaster where radioactivity was going, how bad it was, but the information was not being shared with, the residents of Fukushima Prefecture, some of whom evacuated into the worst of the plume. The weather changed at one point, carrying radioactive clouds inland, and then it precipitated in snow. And there was an evacuated town that did a spontaneous evacuation. Its mayor gathered thousands of residents, and they went up into the mountains to try to get away from, the fallout. They evacuated right into the plume. And the Japanese government also knew that they were in harm's way because they had meteorological computer programs. Ironically, the acronym was SPEEDI, S-P-E-E-D-I. But several ministries had this computer program, ran it, saw where the radioactivity was at, how bad it was, did not inform these evacuees, and they were out in it. They had no shelter. They were camping out, and the mayor of the town accused the federal government of murder, is how he put it. When the
It
news
sounds
came out.
fun. Sounds about right to me.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about, these secrets that they're keeping. It's not affecting just a few people. We're talking about entire countries. We're talking about the entire global population of what's really happening out there. What kind of, in Japan especially, what kind of radiation sickness is being seen over there? I heard thyroid cancer is just through the roof now.
What, if anything, can you do about it?
Right.
Yeah. Thyroid pathology in children, just like we saw at Chernobyl. There's a pill, it's potassium iodide, that can saturate your thyroid with healthy iodine and block radioactive iodine from entering when you excrete it. Because radioactive iodine is somewhat short-lasting. It's very vicious, but it only lasts for 80 or 160 days. And the Soviet Union versus Poland really showed the difference. There's still to this day a thyroid epidemic in the former Soviet countries because they were covering up the disaster and they weren't distributing pills to their people. But in Poland, as soon as they learned about the disaster, some 3 days in, they distributed potassium iodide pills to their population. They don't have this epidemic. So the thyroid pathology in Japan. One thing I wanted to mention is talk about secrecy. The Japanese government just recently passed the State Secrets Act, which, reporting on Fukushima Daiichi was difficult before, and now it's borderline or actually illegal.
Did they get that protocol from the NSA?
What's that?
Did they get that protocol from the NSA?
Yeah. Now reporters have to worry about whether they're going to go to jail for outing things.
That's
Fukushima
insane.
Daiichi. And the law is all about Fukushima Daiichi. That's where it came from.
So I don't where's the harm in telling people what's actually going on out there? I mean, I don't understand.
Politics,
the industry
baby.
is
It's
so
all
powerful.
politics, sure.
It's one of the biggest players in the United States in terms of political power, economic power. It's even worse in Japan, actually. They largely control the politics. The current party in Japan, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, which has ruled Japan for over 95% of its post-World War II existence, is a pro-nuclear party. It's one of their main planks in their campaign. The U.S. has a lot to answer for in that regard because the U.S. actually brought nuclear power to Japan.
Yeah, I had heard that.
We can get more into that, but the U.S. is very guilty about the situation in Japan. I mean, those were General Electric reactors, for one thing.
So let's take a broad overview here about this technology. It costs billions of dollars to create a reactor. It costs billions of dollars to cool the reactor for the next 25 years after the pool is spent. You don't have anywhere to keep this permanently. And we continuously see these failed reactors cause great damage to the ecology and to life as we know it on the planet. So what is the real benefit of nuclear power? I mean, we're having this amount of disasters that needs this amount of cleanup work. I mean, I can't even imagine the price tag for Fukushima. Where are we saving money with using nuclear power? And, well, let's take that one first.
Well, before we, discuss alternatives or anything, isn't there, I made a joke about France earlier, but isn't there a large region in Europe and some Scandinavian countries that are actually doing it right and, they're extremely efficient and they're, go ahead.
That claim is made about France many times. They're pointed to as like the example of how to do nuclear right. But when you start delving into it, I mean, they have real problems in France. They reprocess their radioactive waste, which means plutonium extraction, to supposedly reuse as reactor fuel, but that's largely not happening. And that's $1 billion a year subsidy that French taxpayers and ratepayers are paying for. When they do reprocess, they're discharging 100 million gallons per year of radioactive liquid waste into the English Channel. That's traveled all the way to the Canadian Arctic. And they haven't solved their waste problem. They still have to re-solidify the liquid high-level radioactive waste and then bury it in deep geologic disposal. They don't have a dump, so they're just building this mountain of waste. Sweden had a very close call several years ago where they lost all cooling to the reactor for a period of time. So really, Nowhere's gotten it right. Some places are luckier than others. So, the billions and tens of billions and hundreds of billions that this industry has gobbled up, I mean, companies are making that money. That's the thing. You've got a company like Bechtel Nuclear, which has built 2/3 of the reactors in the U.S. and half the reactors in the Western world. They're one of the companies that have made all that money.
But all the hidden costs are burdened by the taxpayers, aren't they? Where they're talking about Japan or the U.S. or wherever.
Did a comprehensive subsidies report on nuclear power, ironically enough, unveiled on March 11th of 2011, the day that Fukushima began. So their joke about it is, don't roll out a report when a nuclear catastrophe is beginning, because you're not going to get any press coverage. But the report showed that in the United States, I mean, federal taxpayers and ratepayers have subsidized the nuclear power industry to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, all told.
So it's not that cheap of a technology. I mean, when someone says, well, we need nuclear power because it's cheap to get our electricity, it's total bullshit, isn't it?
One of the findings of that report was it would have been cheaper for the federal government just to provide electricity to the American people than to have subsidized nuclear power, because it ended up that the subsidies were more than the electricity that nuclear ever generated.
That's incredible.
But it's been a huge moneymaker for, certain companies. The electric utilities of this country, like Detroit Edison is one of the worst, have just gobbled it up. And some of the real answers are things like energy efficiency, where you don't use the electricity in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
And Detroit Edison does not make money through energy efficiency. And so they'll have these very successful energy efficiency programs that they will just sabotage and kill off, and they go nowhere.
I certainly don't see them pushing any solar or something that I looked into a few years ago, and we finally put a roof on the house, and I think I got 6 estimates, and one of the 6 had anything to say about solar. And I think we ended up getting our roof for only about $7,000. And the one guy who had a little bit of knowledge about solar said he wanted $35,000 to even, look into it.
Yeah, it's a reflection of, government policies. I mean, Detroit Edison has deployed solar photovoltaics at Monroe County Community College, for example. Mm-hmm. So this could work here. It is working in Germany. Germany has decided to phase out nuclear power completely by 2022, to largely or entirely phase out fossil fuels by mid-century as a climate goal.
Hey, a positive story.
Yeah, we need that at the close here.
Yeah. Germany's showing the way. It's the 4th largest economy in the world, and they are going to go fossil fuel free and nuclear free. They're going to do it through maximized efficiency and renewables like wind and solar. Nice. So the U.S. is going to get left in the dust. That is the future. I mean, Europe is showing the way. Most of the countries, you mentioned France as a bad example, but Germany, Denmark, Spain, a lot of countries, Fukushima was the final straw. And they said, we're phasing out of nuclear. We do care about climate because we have coastlines, for one thing. So there are some positive examples. Japan's another one. Not a single of the 50 remaining reactors in Japan are operating today.
Oh, they're all closed now, huh?
Yeah, the grassroots anti-nuclear movement of Japan has kept them closed. And the fight is on, though, because the ruling party is pro-nuclear, so they're trying their darndest to turn them back on, and the people are saying no.
I think it would be really hard to be somebody who's pro-nuclear in Japan right now. That's just my personal opinion.
Prime Minister Abe is trying to sell Japanese reactors overseas. He's just cut deals with United Arab Emirates, India, and Turkey to sell Japanese reactors. So I have to wonder how a country could buy reactor technology from Japan after what's happened.
Right.
Yeah, that's a scary thing too. Well, some of the going out on a highlight here, because we're coming past this hour mark here. What type of future technologies do you see on the horizon that would be safer and just as powerful as nuclear technologies? I mean, obviously we mentioned wind, solar. I had the pleasure of working for a solar mechanical company a few years ago. I did about 6 months with them, and DTE, they did have a project that was called Solar Currents, and you could actually get tax credits. I forget exactly how it worked.
I think I pay into that every month. I haven't.
You probably
I don't reap
yeah.
anything from it.
But
yet,
the program went so fast. Like, we were putting these solar PV systems in on people's houses, and they were, net zero energy. But, those credits ran out fairly quick. So once those credits are done, you're still looking at a $50,000, $60,000 solar price tag on your home. So when you look at the energy that you're creating, when do you get that payoff point? It's many years down the road. If somebody's well off, that might be something you could look into. But I mean, most people who are listening know what the Detroit economy is right now, and most places in the United States and in the globe since the crash. So what can we use that's safer and just as powerful? Because I know coal is just as nasty almost.
I mean, we've started talking about renewables, which are a no-brainer, but that's very frustrating to see the positive example set, and the U.S. just chooses not to get on board.
Sure.
Well, even despite the bad politics in this country compared to Germany, for example, I mean, wind and solar are just growing by leaps and bounds. So the figures are pretty mind-boggling. Like solar last year, solar PV installed more capacity in 1 year than it had in the previous 40 years.
Yeah. That's awesome.
So
and the efficiency's
now doubling
getting better
its
too.
capacity each year.
Big time.
You've got one of the biggest solar PV manufacturers in the entire country based out of Toledo. That's First Solar.
Yep. Who's that?
And then First Solar.
First Solar.
Its factory is just off of the toll road because I pass it as I'm traveling from D.C. to West Michigan. And I've seen the factory grow over the years, so that's very hopeful. Good paying manufacturing jobs in Toledo, Ohio.
Now, when you mentioned the growth over the last year was more than the last 40, did you mean globally?
That was a U.S. figure.
Okay.
And granted, solar PV is a very small fraction of electricity in the United States, so doubling that is more doable because there's so little to begin with. But the rate is very hopeful. Wind is also, in the U.S., it's the fastest growing source of new electricity in the United States. And one of the places where it's really taken off has been West Texas, ironically enough. And that began under the George W. Bush governorship. So,
do they have a turbine above every oil rig?
Yeah, right. That's the problem.
I think I think initially the technology was only, going to give you payback in some very small regions, so people weren't even investigating it. And now it's starting to reach the point where you're getting a break even in a lot of the U.S.,
Well, new wind is half as expensive as new nuclear to install. One of the really big potentials is in Lake Erie on the north coast of Ohio. And you can already see wind turbines of industrial scale in the urban Cleveland environment. Just east of Cleveland, there are factories that have wind turbines to provide their electricity. So this is just going to keep growing. The economics really mandate that be the case. Nuclear, the price tags are skyrocketing, while wind and solar are becoming more affordable.
I don't know when was the last time you were back in this area, and I'm not sure when I think the first wind field that was built, the bigger one in the Thumb area, I don't remember the city, but there's another pretty large,
or something like that.
There's one out in the Ludington area now. I think it was 55 turbines.
Well, when I'm traveling, I see those blades rolling down on those huge semi trucks every time I take a trip.
It was cool. We got to do a tour, and I think the county required that they had to be, I think it was 2 miles inland, because the residents were concerned about the
not in my
aesthetics,
backyard.
but it was pretty cool. Yeah.
Another hopeful development is floating wind turbines. The first one in the world was just deployed off of the coast of Maine, in the Gulf of Maine, and apparently there's enough potential for 5,000 megawatts of floating wind turbines. So that's 5 full-size atomic reactors worth of electricity, only it's going to be made by floating wind turbines that are anchored to the seabed. So that's a whole other development, is offshore wind has huge potential.
Right, so it's the movement of the water that's creating the action, right?
No,
it's wind, but it's
there's tidal technologies.
That's
too,
what I was thinking.
Yeah, there is that, but these are actually wind turbines, and the reason for the floating aspect is it saves them the money of not having to physically anchor it to the seafloor, which is very expensive. So what they do is they build these floating platforms that are anchored to the seafloor by cables, and they save a lot of money on just the physical infrastructure that way. But they're still very functional and efficient.
Cool. Well, I'm glad we kind of discussed some of the up and coming positive things that are out there. Yeah. why don't you tell us some of the future goals of Beyond Nuclear? What are you guys trying to accomplish short term and long term?
Well, one of our big campaigns is called Freeze Our Fukushimas, and we took the name from the Freeze campaign against nuclear weapons back in the early 80s. And what we're trying to do is get permanently shut down the 31 atomic reactors in the United States, like Fermi 2, that are identical or very similar in design to Fukushima Daiichi. So that's one of our top priorities. We just met a deadline at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission called the Waste Confidence Deadline. This really ironic Orwellian phrase. The NRC has waste confidence that we can solve our waste problem. And that's very hopeful too. That fight's going to keep going. What we could do if we win that fight, and it's probably going to go to the federal courts, is we could block the 20-year license extension at Davis-Besse on Lake Erie. Because if they cannot guarantee that the waste can be safely stored and eventually disposed of, then they can't give a 20-year license extension. So that could block Fermi 3, this new proposed reactor in Monroe County, because you can't go making high-level radioactive waste that you have no answers for.
Well, it seems like a lot of that's already been happening.
Oh, they've made a lot, and it's taken, over 50 years of commercial nuclear power for us to win a court victory that ordered the NRC to do an environmental impact statement. I mean, that's what floors me is, here's high-level radioactive waste, some of the worst stuff humans have ever created. And the U.S. government was fine with it for 50 years before nonprofit groups took them to court and got the court to tell them, well, you should probably do an environmental impact statement on this. That court victory took place in 2012, and we just survived these dozen hearings around the country. The closest one to here, Michigan, was Perrysburg, Ohio, outside of Toledo. And we did a really good job. I mean, lots of comments and very high-quality comments. And we got some very powerful allies in the process. The states of New York and Vermont and Connecticut and Massachusetts were right there with us. And it's very likely going to go back to court. The NRC did such a bad job on this environmental impact statement.
Crazy. How about long term? What are you guys' goals long term? Just to decommission all weapons in all nuclear power production?
Yeah, we are for abolition of atomic power and nuclear weaponry and replacement with better ideas like international conflict resolution and like we said, renewables and efficiency on the electricity front.
So one last question I have for you is, if they were going to close Fermi 2 right now in southeast Michigan, what kind of effect would it have on the power grid, and where would we get the replacement energy right off the bat? Like if they had to shut it down, I know it's a long process to shut down a reactor like that, but what is the alternative? Just coal? If they don't bring in a bunch of wind farms and solar farms, is it just coal?
Well, that's the news about wind and solar PV is that it's deployable within months, actually.
Okay.
Whereas atomic reactors can take
years,
sometimes
right?
decades before they're able to generate electricity. So there's a glut of electricity, there's an excess, and so there's only certain times a year, like really hot summer days, or here we are in really cold winter days, where there's increased demand for electricity. And so, incredibly, we have this excess of electricity except for a very few days per year. And so, Fermi 2 could go away and not be missed most of the year, if not the entire year. And we can make up for its electricity supply within months if we deploy wind and solar. So the answers are actually pretty straightforward, but it's the political and economic power of the DTEs of the world that prevent these things from happening.
I think that was evident when I was completely shocked at the automotive economic downturn, because, you were starting to hear a lot more about wind and solar, and they were opening up photovoltaic, like First Solar, and we had all these empty manufacturing facilities just sitting here waiting, and that was the rescue. I just saw that as the rescue, and nothing happened. Nothing at all happened. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
Well, money talks and bullshit walks, apparently. One thing I do remember is when I was a kid, I forget how old I was, but I actually took a field trip to Fermi 2. We went down there, and I actually got to walk inside of one of the vacant cooling towers. I don't know if this was in high school or middle school. It was right around, early high school, things like that. It was amazing to look up in there. And I remember looking down at the pool of water and thinking, what in the world is under here? So now I think I have a little bit better understanding of what goes on in the basin of the belly of the beast, as they say.
I remember that. When Jason got home that day, he was so excited. He was glowing.
That's a good one, Jeff. That's real good.
An unhealthy glow.
Well, Kevin, thanks a lot for being with us today. You really dropped a lot of science on us. I appreciate all your expertise.
Yeah, I feel like I was uneducated, and now I'm a bit more educated.
Yeah, I feel like I just got a Matrix upgrade. Yeah. Can you tell us where people can find Beyond Nuclear and you?
Well, our website is www.beyondnuclear.org, and my email is kevin@beyondnuclear.org.
Excellent. You guys are on Facebook and Twitter, I'm assuming?
Yeah, I was busy before Facebook and Twitter were invented, so I pretty much lurk in the email world. Maybe someday I will wake up and smell the coffee.
All right.
But yeah, our organization does have Facebook and Twitter, but it's not me on there. I have to admit.
Just get it through the website.
Yeah. All right, people, we'll get connected out there. Our music, again, our intro is brought to you by Secrets. You can visit our website, intellectualgentlemensclub.com. We have the blog there. All the podcasts are listed on there. We can subscribe right to iTunes and Stitcher. We have a YouTube link. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Visit our support page if you want to help us out with our hosting costs and such. We have featured music exited today by PhD Quest. He works on the Master of the Arts podcast, and he's part of the Quest Lab podcast. So check them out there. You can find him on Twitter at PhD Quest. And hang loose out there, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.
Seriously? You're still listening? Well, why don't you download all the podcasts? www.intellectualgentlemensclub.com. iTunes, Stitcher, the whole works. Go get the rest of them. Later.
I never said I was a gentleman, motherfuckers.